In February, the golden lobbies of Dubai were full. The machine was running perfectly. 30 days later, roughly 2 out of every 3 rooms were completely empty. Occupancy plummeted from 84% to a devastating 33%. Behind the tinted glass and the infinity pools, thousands of rooms were suddenly taken offline. Tourist markets fell violently quiet. Restaurant terraces emptied out. The beaches beside the world's most luxurious properties lost their crowds overnight. But the massive buildings could not simply stop functioning. The gigantic district cooling systems kept running. The desalinated water kept flowing. The utility bills kept arriving. A city built entirely to host the global elite suddenly found itself hosting nothing but silence. And this silence is incredibly expensive. What happens when a machine designed to defy the brutal desert suddenly loses the one thing that pays for its survival? This is not just a temporary dip in tourist numbers. This is the story of a fragile empire realizing that when the guests finally disappear, the desert immediately begins taking the city back. There is a very specific sound to a luxury hotel operating at peak capacity. It is the subtle hum of quiet conversations in marble hallways, the constant movement of high-speed elevators, and the clinking of crystal in the lobby lounge. In February, Dubai was broadcasting that exact sound to the world. Hotels were operating at nearly 85% capacity. The illusion of endless demand was intact. Then, within 4 short weeks, the sound evaporated. By March, the occupancy rate collapsed to 33%. To truly understand the terrifying scale of this drop, you must mentally walk down a massive hotel corridor. It means that out of every 3 doors you pass, 2 of them hide an empty bed. 2 of them are actively consuming energy, filtering air, and chilling water for absolutely no one. The beds were still perfectly made. The marble floors were still polished to a mirror shine. But the people had vanished. This was not a slow, seasonal transition that operators could prepare for. This was an abrupt and brutal halt. The suddenness of the drop exposed a fundamental systemic vulnerability in the entire Dubai economic model. This is a city that does not have a domestic tourism market large enough to sustain its massive towering infrastructure. It relies entirely on a constant, uninterrupted flow of long-haul flights, delivering fresh foreign wealth every single day. When that aviation conveyor belt stops, the scale of the emptiness becomes a financial nightmare. An empty hotel in London or Tokyo is surrounded by a living, breathing city of millions of pedestrians who might still visit the restaurant or the rooftop bar. An empty resort in Dubai is completely isolated. The silence spilled out of the glamorous lobbies and infected the streets. At the Al Seef waterfront, the promenade stood eerily quiet. The sprawling outdoor terraces, designed for thousands of wealthy diners, held only a handful of scattered people. The carefully curated private beaches near the Burj Al Arab, usually crowded with international money, felt entirely abandoned. How does one of the busiest hospitality markets on Earth lose most of its occupied rooms in a matter of weeks? The answer lies in a toxic combination of regional instability, aviation disruptions, and the simple, undeniable fact that the illusion of endless global demand had finally fractured. But empty rooms were only the first major warning sign. Soon, the rooms themselves began disappearing from the market altogether. Closing a luxury hotel room is an act of ultimate surrender. It is a quiet admission by the owners that the cost of keeping the lights on is far greater than the fragile hope of finding someone to sleep in the bed. As the demand collapsed, the local hospitality industry was forced into a drastic and humiliating retreat. In April, approximately 5,400 rooms were entirely removed from the Dubai market supply. Some operators desperately called it temporary maintenance. Others tried to rebrand the panic as strategic renovation. But the exact timing revealed the absolute truth. You do not initiate massive emergency closures at the exact moment your occupancy drops by 54%, unless you are bleeding serious cash. Thousands of windows looking out over the Arabian Gulf simply went dark. Elevators were heavily programmed to skip entire floors. The physical footprint of Dubai luxury was actively shrinking to protect itself from complete financial ruin. They promised the press that some rooms would return in May, others in October, and the rest by early next year. But taking a room offline in a hyper-competitive global market is incredibly dangerous. It signals severe weakness. Was this simply the perfect time to renovate, or was it the most desperate attempt to stop hemorrhaging money? Every single closed door represents a severed revenue stream that was originally supposed to pay back billions of dollars in aggressive real estate loans. This entire city was built on the dangerous premise of perpetual expansion. Every towering crane on the skyline was justified by the arrogant belief that there would always be more tourists next year than there were this year. When 5,400 rooms are violently unplugged from the grid, that fundamental economic promise is permanently broken. The investors who bought into the dream of endless high returns are left holding empty, silent concrete. But shutting down a wing of a building is actually the easy part of the crisis. The true financial horror was unfolding inside the thousands of rooms that forcefully remained open, because closing a room stops it from losing money directly. But what happens to the luxury rooms that are left behind in a desperate fight for survival? Dubai hotels once sold the ultimate psychological product, which is pure scarcity. They sold a private white sand beach, a towering skyline suite, a dining table that ordinary tourists could not possibly afford. The message to the global consumer was incredibly arrogant, but highly effective. You were supposed to feel overwhelmingly lucky just to be allowed inside the building. But when the tourists vanished from the vast airport terminals, something fascinating and profoundly humiliating happened to the luxury market. Luxury suddenly stopped rejecting customers. Luxury aggressively began chasing them. The exclusive velvet rope was taken down and turned into a desperate fishing net. The official tourism portals began broadcasting a massive flood of desperate summer offers. The nightly room rates were slashed without mercy. They threw in complimentary buffet breakfasts. They offered guaranteed massive room upgrades. They handed out expensive spa vouchers and practically begged guests to stay for incredibly late checkouts. Yesterday, the penthouse was an exclusive privilege reserved for the elite. Today, it comes with a discount code and a free meal. This exposes the fatal trap of discounting luxury. Reduce the rate too little, and the room remains completely empty, burning cash. Reduce it too much, and the customer permanently learns that Dubai luxury was always highly negotiable. You train your wealthy clientele to wait for the panic. If a 5-star exclusive experience can be sold at a 40% discount today, will anyone ever pay the original premium price tomorrow? A designer handbag can sit on a high-end boutique shelf for 6 solid months, waiting for a wealthy buyer. A sports car can sit in an air-conditioned showroom until the global economy recovers. But a hotel room has the most unforgiving lifespan in the entire global economy. It only has one single night to survive. If room 1207 is empty tonight, that potential revenue is completely gone forever. It cannot be placed in a warehouse. It cannot be bundled and resold next week. At the exact stroke of midnight, the financial value of an empty room drops to absolutely zero. Every single night at midnight, thousands of perfect, pristine luxury products across Dubai are expiring simultaneously, generating absolutely nothing. How many empty midnights can a deeply leveraged luxury hotel survive before the international banks finally step in? They can heavily cut the price. They can offer endless free massages. They can beg the local residents of the UAE to book a cheap weekend staycation. But there is one relentless customer the hotel owners can never persuade to leave: the climate. Because the guests finally checked out, but the hostile desert environment certainly did not. This is the hidden dark reality that makes the Dubai tourism crisis entirely different from a temporary economic slump in Paris, London, or Tokyo. Dubai is engaged in an endless, aggressive, and ultimately unwinnable war against nature. It is a sprawling metropolis that simply should not exist in its current geographic form. It was forced into reality by pumping billions of dollars into massive artificial life support systems. The environment here is not just a beautiful scenic backdrop. It is a deeply hostile natural force, actively trying to violently reclaim the land every single day. The brutal summer heat routinely pushes toward 50 degrees Celsius. The suffocating humidity rolling off the hot Gulf waters makes the thick air feel completely unbreathable. To keep a massive luxury hotel functioning in this extremely hostile environment requires a staggering, terrifying consumption of natural resources. You are not just maintaining a standard building. You are maintaining an entirely artificial, isolated biosphere. Every single drop of water in the massive infinity pools, every long hot shower the guests take, every decorative cascading fountain in the marble lobby comes from massive, incredibly energy-intensive desalination plants. Millions of gallons of raw seawater must be boiled, filtered, and processed, using massive amounts of fossil fuels just so a transient tourist can watch fresh water cascade over imported stone. The towering glass towers act as massive vertical greenhouses, capturing and magnifying the brutal, relentless desert sun. To counter this deadly greenhouse effect, the buildings rely on vast networks of district cooling. Millions of tons of artificially chilled water are continuously pumped through deep underground pipes to keep the sprawling lobbies at a perfect crisp 20 degrees, while the black asphalt outside literally melts under the sun. When the hotel is full at 85% occupancy, the wealthy tourists unknowingly pay to fund this massive environmental war. Their extremely high nightly rates heavily subsidize the massive carbon footprint and the astronomical monthly utility bills required to successfully hold the desert back. But what happens when the occupancy rate violently drops to 33%? The mathematical reality turns deadly. The desert does not care if your grand hotel is empty. The blinding sun does not dim just because your international bookings are down. The chilled water must keep continuously circulating through the veins of the building. The massive industrial air handling units must keep forcing freezing cold air into the grand empty atriums. The power-hungry desalination plants must keep burning heavy fuel to keep the luxury plumbing from running completely dry. The perfect empty room, sitting high above the quiet city, with its freshly made bed and freezing cold air, represents a catastrophic financial bleed. The desperate owners are burning millions of dollars, fighting the extreme heat for guests who are simply not there. The massive electricity bill becomes the most loyal, consistent guest in the entire building, and it ruthlessly demands payment every single month. Without the constant injection of tourist money, the grand illusion of sustainability completely shatters. The city is forced to quickly consume its own stored wealth, just to prevent the physical infrastructure from literally melting back into the burning sand. This is the exact moment the desert quietly begins winning the war. You cannot effectively quarantine the deep financial emptiness of a hotel room. It acts as a highly infectious economic disease. When a luxury room stays consistently empty, it triggers a devastating and unstoppable domino effect that violently ripples through the entire urban ecosystem. Think of an international tourist as a vital biological vehicle designed to inject fresh foreign currency directly into the veins of the city. When the suitcase never arrives at the hotel lobby, the money never enters the wider economic system. The completely empty room means the massive hotel restaurant is forced to toss out expensive, perishable imported ingredients. The empty restaurant means the waiters see their scheduled shifts heavily cut and their vital cash tips completely vanish. The empty hotel driveway means the desperate taxi drivers endlessly circle the scorching empty streets, burning expensive fuel, looking for fares that simply do not exist. It means the massive luxury retail malls, the giant sparkling cathedrals of consumption, built specifically to extract maximum wealth from wealthy visitors, see their daily foot traffic absolutely plummet. The entire massive retail sector of Dubai is strictly engineered around the fundamental assumption of endless flowing pedestrian traffic. When that human flow suddenly stops, the deep structural cracks in the economy become impossible to hide. News agencies reported the deeply unsettling quiet stretching from the historic-themed tourist alleys of Al Seif to the modern sprawling waterfronts of Dubai Creek Harbor. These are massive, multi-billion-dollar real estate plays that only function properly if tens of thousands of people are constantly moving through them, buying expensive coffee, taking boat rides, and purchasing luxury souvenirs. Without the massive crowds, they are just empty, hollow movie sets, desperately waiting for actors to arrive. The intense financial pressure moves down the economic ladder relentlessly. It hits the vulnerable migrant workforce first. The cleaners, the drivers, the hospitality staff, who rely on sending remittances back to South Asia and the Philippines, feel the severe contraction immediately. Then the rot hits the local suppliers, the massive food importers, the lavish event management companies. Finally, it travels all the way up the chain to the billionaire real estate developers and the heavily exposed international banks holding the massive construction loans. Dubai could no longer pretend to treat the empty rooms as a private, isolated problem for individual hotel owners. The heavy silence was rapidly becoming totally systemic. The financial pressure was growing so incredibly intense that the invisible hand of the free market was no longer strong enough to fix the bleeding. The government was absolutely forced to step in to stop the collapse. When an urban economy is genuinely healthy, the government stays quietly in the background and happily lets the cash registers ring. When a city suddenly announces a massive emergency financial intervention, you are no longer looking at a routine seasonal low. You are looking at a glaring red alarm bell. Dubai authorities publicly pledged 2.5 billion dirhams. That is roughly $681 million in direct financial support, focused heavily on the most dangerously exposed sectors, including tourism and retail. Global news agencies reported that nervous business leaders were urgently asked how to somehow bring tourists and foreign investors back to the struggling city. You absolutely do not deploy hundreds of millions of dollars if the economic machine is simply undergoing routine seasonal maintenance. You only deploy that kind of massive capital when core market confidence is violently cracking. The government bailout is a desperate, highly visible attempt to patch the massive hull of a sinking ship before the remaining passengers notice the dark water rising. But pumping raw cash into the system does not solve the fundamental fatal flaw of the Dubai economic model. You cannot simply buy international tourists with a government grant. You can only temporarily subsidize the bleeding losses of the wealthy people who own the empty buildings. The rapid injection of $681 million is a stark, terrifying admission that the entire ecosystem is far more incredibly fragile than the glossy marketing brochures continuously claim. It proves beyond any doubt that the entire spectacular towering skyline is entirely and completely dependent on external global validation. If the world collectively decides to stop flying through the Gulf for a few short months due to rising regional instability or shifting global travel trends, the internal domestic economy of Dubai does not have the strength to support itself. It is a terrifying realization for any major international investor. You have successfully built the most expensive, most luxurious, and most energy-intensive infrastructure on the entire planet, but you do not actually control the people who are supposed to pay to use it. You are entirely at the mercy of fragile global supply chains, shifting airline schedules, and the heavily fluctuating anxieties of international travelers. If this were only an ordinary predictable low season, it would never require an extraordinary emergency financial response. The government was no longer just trying to save individual failing hotels. They were rapidly spending hundreds of millions of dollars to restore something far harder to rebuild than a glass skyscraper. They were desperately trying to restore the broken illusion of endless invincibility. The entire looming crisis of this massive artificial desert empire can be perfectly understood by looking deeply at just one single hotel room. It is beautifully, flawlessly designed. The expensive automation silently opens the heavy, thick blackout curtains. The towering, sprawling skyline of the city stretches out endlessly beyond the thick, reinforced glass. The air inside is perfectly, fiercely cooled to fiercely combat the brutal, deadly heat waiting just millimeters away on the other side of the window. The expensive minibar is fully comprehensively stocked. The premium sheets are perfectly, flawlessly white, but the beautiful room is completely, horribly silent. There is no heavy suitcase resting on the rack. There is no wealthy guest walking across the carpet. There is absolutely zero revenue being generated. Dubai absolutely did not build its massive, sprawling hotel empire for this kind of silence. It built it for a globalized world that it arrogantly assumed would never, ever stop arriving. It built its foundation on the dangerous belief that human engineering and endless borrowed capital could permanently, easily defeat the desert and magically suspend the strict rules of economic gravity. But the surrounding desert is incredibly patient. It quietly waits just outside every single glass window and every freezing air-conditioned lobby. It forcefully forces the fragile city to spend millions of dollars every single day just to weakly maintain the perimeter. Every single empty bed now quietly asks the exact same haunting, terrifying question. How long can an expensive artificial city built exclusively for the world survive when the world firmly stops checking in? The massive air conditioner is humming loudly, the digital clock is striking midnight, and the financial value of the perfect room has just violently dropped to absolutely zero once again. This documentary analysis is thoroughly based on public data, industry reports, and verified occupancy statistics available at the exact time of extensive research. Global economic conditions, international tourism trends, and regional stability are constantly subject to change. The narrative explicitly explores systemic economic pressures, severe environmental challenges, and financial mechanisms rather than individual business failures. It is absolutely not intended as financial investment or personal travel advice. If you truly value deep investigations that look far beyond the polished, expensive marketing campaigns and heavily uncover the brutal economic realities hiding behind the gleaming skyline, make sure to subscribe. The absolute next major warning sign is rarely exactly where the glossy brochure tells you to look.